fire clawed the night sky over the Colorado Valley, turning the barn into a roaring pyre of blackened timber. A single shot cracked out, closer than any sound had a right to be. Who would dare strike a ranch like this under cover of darkness, when the whole territory already whispered of debts and quiet threats? Smoke choked the yard. Shadows moved beyond the flames, shapes that belonged to no one who worked this land. Another volley rang out. Glass shattered somewhere inside the house. Boots pounded hard across the porch boards, coming closer. She gripped the shotgun tighter, heart slamming against her ribs, the weapon heavy and foreign in hands that once only turned pages of poetry in a distant eastern parlor. The door behind her creaked open. Someone was coming in. The train screamed into Willow Bend like it didn't want to stop, like it knew something she didn't. Rosalind Ashworth held her satchel against her chest. Not because it was heavy, because her hands needed something to do, because if she let them hang empty at her sides she was afraid they would start shaking and never stop. Colorado Territory, 1864. Dust everywhere, the kind that gets into your teeth, into your collar, into the seams of a traveling dress that cost more than most families here would see in a year. She stepped down onto the platform. The heat hit her first, then the smell. Livestock and coal smoke, and something dry underneath it all. Something that smelled like the whole territory had been baking under the sun since the beginning of time. Boston never smelled like this. Boston never felt like this either. Wide open, merciless, like the sky itself was deciding whether to let you stay. She scanned the platform. A man was supposed to be here, holding a sign. Her name on it, maybe. Some small mercy of recognition in a place where she recognized nothing, and no one recognized her. No sign, no man, just dust and heat, and the low rumble of a wagon somewhere behind the station house, and her own heartbeat, which had picked up a strange, panicked rhythm she didn't like at all. She waited. 10 minutes. 15. Which was when the fear started climbing up her throat like something with claws. Because what if he'd changed his mind? Because what if the letters, all those careful, hopeful letters, had been written by a man who no longer existed? Because what if she had sold everything, the house, the books, her mother's silver, every last shred of a life that used to make sense, for nothing? Stop it, she told herself. Stop it right now. You are not the kind of woman who falls apart on a train platform. Except she felt exactly like that kind of woman. Exactly. You lost, miss. A boy, freckled, hat too big for his head, the brim nearly swallowing his eyebrows. 19 maybe, though something in his voice made him sound younger. I'm looking for a Mr. Pruitt, she said. Alonzo Pruitt. I was told he'd meet the train. The boy's face did something complicated. Something that wasn't quite a wince, and wasn't quite pity, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. You'd be the bride, then? Not a question. Her whole body went still. I beg your pardon? Mr. Pruitt's bride. From the east. He shifted his weight, looked at his boots. He's at the store. Said to bring you there if you came. As though there had been some question of whether she would. She followed him. Willow Bend unspooled around her as they walked. A single wide street. False-fronted buildings leaning into each other like old men sharing a secret. Women in plain calico. Men who looked like the land had carved them out of something harder than flesh. It was nothing like Boston. And some small, traitorous part of her, the part that had spent 3 months writing to a stranger, imagining a life, imagining a face to go with the careful, tidy handwriting, that part of her had wanted it to feel like coming home. Didn't. Felt like landing on the surface of the moon. The general store had a bell, over the door, that jangled when the boy pushed it open. Rosalind stepped inside, blinking against the dimmer light, and there he was, Alonzo Pruitt, older than his letters had suggested, thinner in the face than she'd pictured. A thin man with receding hair and soft hands, wiping those hands on an apron like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. Ah, he said, you must be Miss Ashworth. Rosalind, she said, and extended her hand. His grip was limp, damp, nothing like the hand she'd imagined holding when she married. "Thank you for arranging my passage, Mr. Pruitt. Your letters were very kind." Which was true. Which was also, she would come to understand in the next 60 seconds, the last kind thing that would be said in this room. Yes, well. He looked past her, toward the door, like he was hoping someone else might walk through it and rescue him from this conversation. About that, her stomach dropped an inch. "There's been a change of circumstance. Another inch. My sister," he said, "arrived from St. Louis. Unexpected. She's keeping house for me now. Managing things. I don't understand. What I'm saying, Miss Ashworth, is that I no longer require a wife." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Rings spreading out from the center of her chest until they reached her fingertips, her knees, the soles of her feet. Because she had sold everything. Because there was no house in Boston to go back to. No furniture. No father either. He'd been 6 months in the ground before she'd even answered that advertisement, before creditors started circling like something with wings and teeth, before she understood that a respectable woman with no money and no husband was not, in fact, respectable at all. Just poor. Just alone. Just a problem someone else would eventually have to solve. "I sold everything to come here," she said, quiet, because if she raised her voice it might crack, and she refused to crack in front of this man. "I've arranged a room at the boarding house," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "For tonight. Tomorrow there's a train east. I'll cover the fare. And what am I meant to do when I arrive? I have no house, no family. No! I'm sorry for your troubles." He said it the way a man says grace before a meal he's already decided he doesn't want. Automatic. Empty. "But I have to think of my family now." Something in her chest went cold and very, very still. "I was your family," she said. "You proposed it yourself. In writing. Circumstances change. Circumstances." She almost laughed. Almost. Except laughing felt one half step away from something much worse, something with tears in it, and she would not do that here. Not in front of this man. Not in front of the boy still standing awkwardly by the door, with her satchel dangling from his hand. "Jessie," Alonzo said, turning away from her like the matter was settled, like she was already forgotten. "Take Miss Ashworth's bag to the boarding house." And that was it. That was the whole of it. 3 months of letters. A father's grave barely settled. An ocean of a country crossed by rail. Reduced to a man's back, as he returned to his ledger, adding up numbers that mattered more to him than she did. The bell over the door jangled again. "Pruitt," a voice said, deep, rough at the edges like gravel under a boot heel. "I need wire cutters and 20 pounds of nails. The last batch you sold me was worthless." Rosalind turned, and there he was, the man from the train platform. She hadn't known his name then, hadn't cared to, in the chaos of arriving, but she'd seen him. Tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the doorframe. Shoulders like something built to carry weight, real weight, not the imagined burdens of drawing rooms and dinner parties. A hat pushed back on his head, revealing a face the sun had gone to work on years ago, and never stopped. His eyes found her first, before Alonzo, before anything else in the room. Blue, startlingly blue, the kind of blue that didn't belong on a face that hard. "Everything all right, ma'am?" "Perfectly fine," she said, and heard how stiff it sounded even, as the words left her mouth. Alonzo straightened, visibly relieved by the interruption. "Not at all, Holloway. Just finishing up business with Miss Ashworth. She's on the eastbound tomorrow." The stranger's gaze sharpened. "Ashworth," he repeated. "The mail order bride." She flinched at the term, at the bluntness of it, at how small it made everything feel. 3 months of letters, a father's death, an entire uprooted life, compressed down into 2 words that made her sound like a crate of goods shipped in on the same train as the nail order. That was the arrangement. she said, chin lifting. Though it seems Mr. Pruitt has revised his terms. The man, Holloway, she thought, filing the name away, turned to Alonzo. Something in his jaw had gone tight. You're sending her back. My sister's arrived. There's no need for. You let a woman travel 2,000 miles on your word, and now you're handing her a ticket home like she's returned merchandise? Alonzo's face went a mottled, uncomfortable red. It's not your concern, Holloway. It becomes my concern, the man said low and even. When a man in this town behaves without a shred of honor. Silence. Rosalind stood very still in the middle of it, feeling like she'd become furniture. A prop in a conversation happening around her rather than with her. Which was, she supposed, the theme of the afternoon. The stranger turned to her, really looked at her this time. The dust on her hem, the proud, aching stillness in the way she held herself. The dress that had cost too much and now meant nothing. Miss Ashworth, he said, are you still interested in staying in Willow Bend? I came here with that intention. Then I have an alternative to the eastbound train. He took his hat off. Dark hair underneath, damp at the edges from the heat. My housekeeper left 2 weeks back. Her mother took ill. My ranch needs someone to run the house until I find a permanent solution. Fair wages. 3 months. If you want to go east after that, I'll pay your fare myself. She stared at him, searching his face for the catch. Because there had to be a catch. Because nothing in the last 3 months had come without one. You'd hire me without references, she said slowly. A woman you've known for exactly 4 minutes. You were good enough to marry a man you'd never met. A faint, dry twist at the corner of his mouth. I figure that's reference enough for housekeeping. Alonzo sputtered something behind them. Neither of them looked at him. What do you say, Miss Ashworth? Her mind moved fast. Faster than it had all day. Because this was not the rescue she'd imagined. When she boarded that train in Boston. This was not a proposal, not a courtship. Not the tidy future she'd built out of careful letters and careful hope. But it was something. It was a door that hadn't closed yet. I accept, Mr. Holloway. Ezra Holloway. I accept, Mr. Holloway. Though I should warn you my cooking is limited to the basics. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one held carefully in check like a man who hadn't used that particular muscle in a long while. We won't starve, he said. Come on. Jesse, put Miss Ashworth's bag in my wagon instead. Alonzo's protest died somewhere in his throat, as Ezra Holloway turned toward the door, put his hat back on, and held it open for her like the last hour hadn't happened at all. Rosalind followed him out into the blinding afternoon light, and did not look back at the store, or the man inside it, or the life that had just quietly, permanently, closed its door behind her. The wagon ride out of town was quiet, which suited her, because if she'd had to make conversation just then, she wasn't certain what would have come out of her mouth. Gratitude, maybe, or the sharp, undignified sound of a woman finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the day. Neither seemed appropriate for a wagon seat next to a man she'd known for less than an hour. They'll talk, Ezra said eventually, breaking the silence without looking at her. His eyes stayed on the road, the reins loose and easy in his hands. What will they say? That Ezra Holloway claimed Alonzo Pruitt's bride for himself. A pause. It isn't true, of course, but that won't stop them saying it. I'm not anyone's to claim, Rosalind said. Sharper than she meant it. I'd have thought that much was obvious after this afternoon. He glanced at her then. Something in his expression she couldn't quite name. No, he said. I don't imagine you are. The wagon rattled on. Prairie grass stretching gold, and endless on either side of the road. The sky enormous overhead. So much bigger than any sky she'd known in Boston, that it made her feel small in a way that wasn't entirely unwelcome. You should know, Ezra said, after another long stretch of silence, that while you're under my roof, you'll be treated with respect, nothing less. I believe you, she said, and the strange thing was she did. The Holloway Ranch announced itself before she saw it. Fence lines stretching farther than seemed reasonable. Cattle scattered across the hills like punctuation marks on a page too large to read all at once. Then the house itself cresting into view, as the wagon topped a rise, 2 stories of solid, honest timber, a porch wrapping the whole front of it, outbuildings scattered behind like a small village of its own. "It's beautiful," she said, because it was. Because there was no use pretending otherwise. "My father built it from nothing," Ezra said. Pride threading quiet through his voice. 100 acres and a dream, he used to say. 5,000 acres now. Best bloodlines in the county. A beat. He died 5 years back. Left it all to me. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, which was, she would learn the particular way Ezra Holloway talked about grief. Brief, final. A door shut quickly, before anyone could see what was behind it. He brought the wagon to a stop and came around to help her down. His hands spanned her waist easily, lifted her like she weighed nothing at all, and for one strange, suspended moment they stood close enough that she could smell leather and sun-warmed cotton and something underneath both of those things that she didn't have a name for yet. Then he stepped back, cleared his throat. "I'll show you inside." The house told its own story. Dishes stacked haphazard in the sink. Boots discarded by the door like their owner had simply stopped caring. Where things landed. A fine layer of dust, over every surface patient and undisturbed, the particular kind of dust that only settles in a house where grief has made a permanent home. "Your room's upstairs," Ezra said, leading her up a broad staircase. "First door on the right. Mine's at the end of the hall. The rest are empty, save when Amos..." He caught himself. "Save when my foreman stays over." The room he showed her was larger than she'd expected. A 4-poster bed. A writing desk beneath a window that looked out toward mountains, so blue-gray in the distance they seemed painted rather than real. "I'll let you settle," he said, setting her satchel on the bed. "Supper's usually 6. Given the circumstances, don't trouble yourself tonight. I can manage." "Nonsense," Rosalind said, already reaching for her hatpins. "Give me half an hour. I'll need to learn the kitchen regardless." Something crossed his face. Respect, maybe, or surprise that looked enough like respect to be mistaken for it. "As you wish," he said. "I'll be in the barn." And then he was gone, and she was alone in a strange room, in a strange house on a strange and enormous continent of grass and sky, and the whole impossible weight of the day finally caught up to her all at once. She sat on the edge of the bed. Breathed, because that morning she had woken up expecting to be a bride by nightfall, and instead she was, what? A housekeeper, an employee, a woman paid wages by a stranger, with sun-bronzed shoulders and startling blue eyes, and a jaw that tightened when he talked about honor like it was a physical thing he could hold in his 2 hands. Which was, she unpacked her few belongings, changed into a simpler dress, tied an apron she found in a drawer around her waist, and went downstairs to see what she had to work with. The pantry was better stocked than she'd feared. Flour, sugar, coffee, tins of preserved vegetables. A root cellar under a trapdoor in the kitchen floor held potatoes, and onions and a few withered carrots that would do well enough. A smokehouse out back yielded ham and bacon. By the time Ezra returned, she had fried ham and boiled potatoes and biscuits browning in the oven, and the kitchen, while far from spotless, no longer looked like it belonged to a house in mourning. He stopped in the doorway. "Smells like my mother's kitchen in here. I hope that's meant as a compliment." "Highest one I've got." He moved to the pump sink to wash his hands. She was the finest cook in 3 counties. They ate at the long kitchen table. Silence at first, awkward, careful, 2 strangers learning the shape of each other's company. But it eased, slowly, into something almost comfortable by the time the biscuits were gone. "Tell me about Boston," he said. So she did. Her father, a professor of literature. The house full of books, concerts, libraries. A life that had felt, at the time, entirely predetermined. The daughter of a professor destined to marry another academic. or perhaps a lawyer, her whole future already written by someone else's hand. She left out the debts, the creditors, the particular indignity of watching her father's furniture carried out the front door by men who wouldn't meet her eyes. But something in Ezra's expression told her he understood what she'd left unsaid anyway. "What made you answer Pruitt's advertisement?" he asked. She considered deflecting. "Decided against it. Necessity," she said. "Mostly. But also, after my father died, I realized how little of my own life I'd ever actually chosen." She met his eyes directly. "Coming west was my choice, even if the circumstances weren't ideal." Ezra nodded slowly. "West is good for that. Reinvention. Most folks out here don't much care where you came from, only what you make of yourself now." "And you? Have you always been a rancher?" A shadow crossed his face. Quick, gone almost before she registered it. "I was away for a time," he said. 27 when the war broke out. Rode east to join it, before the dust of my father's grave had even settled proper." His voice had drifted somewhere distant. "Saw things no man should have to see." A pause. "A ball took me through the shoulder in 63. Discharged after that. Came back changed. Like we all did. But the land was still here. Has a way of healing a man if he lets it. I'm sorry for what you endured." He shrugged. The vulnerability disappeared behind his usual reserve, quick as a door closing. "Long time ago," he said, and stood to gather the plates. Which was, she noted, the second time he'd said that exact phrase about something that clearly still lived somewhere close under his skin. The days that followed found their own rhythm. Rosalind rose before dawn, made breakfast for Ezra, and whichever hands happened to be near the house, watched them clean their plates, with the particular silent gratitude of men, who worked with their hands, and rarely had reason to compliment anything with words. After they scattered to the day's labor, she turned her attention to the house itself. Room by room, she battled the dust and disorder, and in doing so, uncovered a home that had once been carefully loved. A handmade quilt folded at the foot of a bed in an unused room. A collection of pressed wildflowers, brittle with age, tucked between the pages of an old book. Small, quiet evidence of a woman who had once made this house into something more than four walls and a roof. On her fourth day, cleaning the study, she found a bookshelf full of Shakespeare, Dickens, Thoreau. She was running her fingers along the spines, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice in her hand, when Ezra's voice startled her from the doorway. "My mother's collection." She turned. She had excellent taste. She taught at the local school before she married my father. He looked at the book in her hands a beat too long. "She would have liked you." The comment seemed to surprise even him. He cleared his throat quickly, glanced away. "I came to say I'm riding out to the north pasture. Won't be back till after dark. I'll keep a plate warm." He nodded, hesitated at the door like there was something else he meant to say, then touched the brim of his hat and left, and Rosalind stood there a moment longer than necessary, the book still open in her hands, feeling something warm and unfamiliar settle low in her chest. "Stop that," she told herself. "He is your employer. Except the way he'd said she would have liked you kept circling back through her mind for the rest of the afternoon, refusing to be dismissed. She met Amos and Bethany Teague on her fifth evening. Amos was the ranch foreman, gray at the temples, weathered in the particular way of a man who'd spent 40 years outdoors and never once complained about it. His wife Bethany arrived, with him that evening, carrying a jar of preserves and an expression of open, unguarded curiosity. "You're the one from Boston?" Bethany said, settling herself at the kitchen table like she'd done it 100 times before, which Rosalind would learn she had before the house had gone quiet. "I am. Ezra's a good man," Bethany said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement either, something testing hanging in the middle. "But he doesn't let people in easy. You'll want to know that going forward." "I've gathered as much." Bethany's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Give him time. He'll surprise you. Which turned out to be true in ways Rosalind hadn't expected. The accident happened on her 9th day. She was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt among the carrot tops, sleeves rolled to her elbows, dirt under her fingernails in a way that would have horrified anyone in Boston society, and horrified her not at all, when Amos came at a near run across the yard. "Miss Ashworth, boss needs you at the bunkhouse. Got a hand thrown bad." She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. "Has someone gone for the doctor?" "Sent Jessie, but Doc's out at the Whitmore place delivering a baby. Could be hours yet." Which meant it was down to her. She ran inside, gathered clean linens, her sewing kit, a bottle of whiskey for disinfecting, honey for the wound, her grandmother's remedy, the one thing from that side of the family that had survived the crossing west intact. At the bunkhouse, Otis Fenwick lay pale on a narrow cot, his left arm bent at an angle that made her stomach turn, a gash across his forehead bleeding the particular alarming amount that head wounds always did, looking far worse than it likely was. Ezra knelt beside him, his hands steady, but his jaw tight with worry. "Rosalind." Relief cracked through his voice. Bay Gelding took exception to his handling. She knelt, assessed, because there wasn't time for anything else. "We need to clean and stitch the cut first, then set the arm." "Tell me what to do." She did. The whiskey made Otis howl when it hit the open wound. Her stitches were small, and even steady despite the tremor she refused to let reach her hands. The bone setting was harder. It took Ezra's full strength to pull the arm straight, while she guided the bones back into place, and by the time they'd splinted it with strips of wood and clean bandage, all three of them were sweating through their clothes. "You've done this before?" Ezra said quietly. Once Otis had drifted into an exhausted, laudanum soft sleep. "My grandmother was a midwife. She taught me some of the basics." They walked back toward the house together, the last light of the day stretching long shadows across the yard. "You're full of surprises, Rosalind Ashworth." "As are you," she said. He stopped at the porch steps, turned to face her fully. "You've made a difference here already," he said. "The house, the men, even the garden's thriving." Unexpected heat rose to her cheeks. "I'm only doing what needs doing." His eyes held hers a beat too long. Something unspoken passing between them, heavy and warm, and entirely inconvenient. For one suspended moment, she thought he might reach for her hand. Instead, he cleared his throat, gestured toward the door. "You should rest," he said. "Long day." That night, sleep didn't come easy. She lay awake, replaying the moment on the porch. The way he'd looked at her, not as an employee, not even quite as a friend, as something else. Something that made her pulse do things it had no business doing, over a man she'd known 9 days. Which was dangerous, because in less than 3 months she would have to decide. Stay in Willow Bend, or take the fare he'd promised and go back east to what? Nothing. No house, no father, no life waiting to receive her. She turned onto her side, stared at the window at the mountains barely visible in the moonlight. Stop thinking about him, she told herself. Except she couldn't. Not entirely. Not the way his voice had gone rough talking about the war. Not the careful, deliberate way he'd said his mother would have liked you. Eventually, exhaustion won out over the racing of her thoughts, and she slept. It was 3 days later that she found the ledgers. She hadn't meant to. She'd been dusting the study, the same room with the bookshelf, the same room, where he'd told her about his mother, and in reaching to straighten a stack of papers on the desk, she'd knocked half of them to the floor. Which was how she came to be kneeling on the study rug, gathering scattered documents back into some kind of order, when a name jumped out at her from a page that clearly hadn't been meant for her eyes. Drummond. Cornelius Drummond. She knew the name only vaguely. Bethany had mentioned it once, in passing, with the particular careful flatness people use when they don't want to say more than they have to. The biggest landholder in the county, apparently. Richer than anyone had any real business being this far from anywhere. But it wasn't the name itself that stopped her cold. It was the numbers beside it. Promissory note, dated 8 months prior. A sum that made her breath catch, enough to sink a smaller operation twice over, owed by Ezra Holloway to a bank in Denver. Except the bank, reading further, had recently transferred the note to Cornelius Drummond. Her hands had gone very still, because this ranch, this sprawling, beautiful 5,000-acre inheritance that Ezra spoke of with such quiet, careful pride, was not the untouchable fortune the whole county seemed to believe it was. It was mortgaged, and the man now holding that mortgage was not a bank in Denver anymore. It was a single man, a man with a name and a face and, presumably, motives of his own. She sat back on her heels, the papers loose in her lap, her mind racing faster than it had in weeks. Because if Drummond held this note, and if the thought arrived cold and sudden, if Alonzo Pruitt's sudden, desperate rejection of her, that first day had smelled of debt and fear rather than any actual change of heart about his sister, which would mean this wasn't only about Ezra. Which would mean something larger was moving through this town. Something with teeth. Something patient enough to buy up a man's debts quietly, one note at a time, and wait. Wait for what, though? That was the question that wouldn't leave her alone. Wait for the harvest to fail. Wait for a bad season. Wait for a man like Ezra Holloway to stumble. Just once, just enough, footsteps in the hall. She shoved the papers back, into their stack, hands moving fast, heart slamming against her ribs like something trying to escape. By the time Ezra appeared in the doorway, she was upright, duster in hand, the very picture of a woman who had seen nothing at all. Everything all right in here? Fine, she said. Too quick. She heard it herself, the too quick edge of it, and hoped he hadn't. He studied her a moment, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been suspicion, or might have been nothing more than simple tiredness after a long day. Supper in an hour? Of course. He nodded, left, and Rosalind stood alone in the study, the late afternoon light slanting gold across the floorboards, her whole body still thrumming, with the particular electric fear of having glimpsed something she was never meant to see. Because now she knew something Ezra didn't know she knew. And because, and this was the part that frightened her most, more than the numbers, more than the name Drummond, more than any of it, because she had absolutely no idea what she was supposed to do with that knowledge now that she had it. Tell him. Except tell him what, exactly? That she'd been going through his private papers. That she knew about a debt he'd clearly worked very hard to keep quiet, even from his own household. That the man holding his future in one careful, patient hand might not be a stranger in Denver at all, but someone close enough to reach him. Say nothing. Except saying nothing felt like its own kind of lie now. A small, cold weight she would have to carry every time she sat across from him at that kitchen table, every time he thanked her for the house, the garden, the difference she'd made. She pressed her palm flat against the desk to steady herself. Because whatever this was, whatever Cornelius Drummond was quietly building one promissory note at a time, it was bigger than a single ranch. Bigger than a single housekeeper's contract. Bigger, maybe, than the entire careful 3-month arrangement she'd struck with a man whose blue eyes had looked at her like she mattered on the worst day of her life. She didn't know yet how right that instinct was. Didn't know that Alonzo Pruitt's hands had trembled the day he turned her away, not because of any sister at all, but because a man had come to his store 2 weeks prior and mentioned very quietly, very reasonably, that certain debts might be forgiven if certain small favors were rendered in return. Didn't know that the same patient hand reaching for Alonzo's failing business was reaching, note by careful note, toward half the men in Willow Bend. Didn't know, yet, how close that hand had already come to closing around Ezra Holloway's land. All she knew, standing alone in that study with the gold light fading toward evening, was that the ground beneath her feet, the ground she had only just begun, cautiously, gratefully, to believe might finally hold her weight, had just shifted. And that she would have to decide, and soon, whether to walk forward into whatever waited, or run. She heard Ezra's boots on the stairs, calling her down for supper, and she smoothed her apron, and steadied her breath and went. Because whatever waited for her in Willow Bend, whatever Cornelius Drummond was patiently, quietly assembling in the shadows of this town's ledgers, and debts and desperate, cornered men, she was not going to face it by running. Not this time. Not again. The days after the accident folded into each other the way days do when a person is too busy to notice time passing. Otis Fenwick's arm healed slow but clean. Rosalind checked the splint every evening, checked it the way her grandmother had taught her, pressing gentle at the fingertips to make sure the blood still moved where it was supposed to move. Otis complained about the itch under the bandage, complained about missing the branding, complained mostly because complaining was easier than saying thank you, and everyone at that ranch seemed to speak that particular dialect, which was fine, because Rosalind was learning the dialect too, because 3 weeks into her 3 months, she had stopped counting the days like a woman waiting out a sentence. Had started, instead, to notice things. The particular gold the light turned an hour before sunset. The way Bethany hummed while she shelled peas. The way Ezra Holloway's shoulders dropped half an inch the moment he crossed the threshold of his own kitchen. Like the house itself gave him permission to stop bracing against something. She noticed that. She noticed too much of that, if she was honest with herself. Which she tried mostly not to be. The evening rides started small. Ezra mentioned, almost offhand, that there was a creek 2 miles north, with cottonwoods so thick you couldn't see the water, through them till you were standing right on the bank. Mentioned it the way a man mentions weather. Nothing at all. Except 3 days later he was saddling the gentle mare for her, without being asked, and Rosalind understood, somewhere underneath her ribs, that this was not nothing. They rode out most evenings after that. He showed her a meadow gone violet, with wildflowers in a hollow she'd never have found alone. Showed her the exact bend in the creek, where his father had taught him to fish, holding the memory out to her carefully, like something breakable. He'd stand right there, Ezra said, pointing, hands on his hips. Tell me I was doing it wrong even when I wasn't. Sounds like he loved you. He had a strange way of showing it. A pause. Same as most men out here, I suppose. Rosalind looked at him sideways, at the strong line of his jaw, at the way he never quite finished a sentence about anything that mattered, like the words cost him more than he wanted to spend. Is that your way too, Mr. Holloway? A strange way of showing things? Something flickered across his face, caught between amusement and something rawer. Might be, he said, and said nothing else the rest of the ride home, which told her everything and nothing at all. Sunday came, and with it church. The whole town packed into a small white building at the edge of Willow Bend. Women in their best calico. Men scrubbed pink, and uncomfortable in collars they clearly resented. Rosalind sat beside Ezra in the Holloway family pew, and felt every eye in the room find them at once. Whispers. She'd expected whispers. Expected them the way she'd expect rain in April. Most of it was kind enough. A few approving nods, from women who'd clearly heard, by now, about Otis's arm, and the garden, and the kitchen, that no longer smelled of neglect. Bethany squeezed her hand on the way out, warm and firm, and said nothing at all, which somehow said the most. But across the churchyard, near the hitching post, Alonzo Pruitt stood very still, watching them, not with anger exactly, something closer to fear, though Rosalind couldn't have said fear of what. His sister stood beside him, thin-lipped, arms crossed, watching Rosalind the way a woman watches something she's decided in advance to dislike. Alonzo's eyes met Rosalind's for one brief, uncomfortable second. Then he looked away, which struck her as strange, because a guilty man avoids your eyes out of shame. But this had looked like something else entirely, something closer to warning. She didn't understand it yet. She would. The letter came on a Tuesday. Jesse Calloway wrote it out from town himself, apologizing for the delay. Something about the mail wagon losing a wheel outside Denver. Rosalind took the envelope from his hands and felt her stomach drop before she'd even read the return address, because she recognized the hand. Abernathy and Sons, attorneys at law, Boston, Massachusetts. Her father's lawyer, which meant this was not a letter. This was a summons dressed up in careful, formal language, the kind lawyers used to make bad news sound like ordinary business. She read it standing in the yard, sun hot on the back of her neck, and felt the words rearrange themselves into something cold and heavy in her chest. Her father's debts, larger than she'd known. A creditor, a Mr. Josiah Kane, son of the man who'd financed her father's failed publishing venture 2 years before his death, pressing his claim now that the estate had gone unpaid this long. The letter suggested, in the careful, bloodless way lawyers suggest things, that certain arrangements might satisfy the debt entirely. Arrangements, which meant marriage, which meant Josiah Kane, a man she had met exactly once at her father's funeral, and remembered mainly for the cold, assessing way he'd looked at the house's furnishings even, as the casket was still being lowered, wanted to collect on his father's debt by collecting her. She folded the letter, unfolded it, read it again like the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder the second time. They didn't. Stop panicking, she told herself. It's a suggestion, not a demand. You are 2,000 miles away. You are safe. Except safety, she was learning, was a much smaller word out here than she'd thought back in Boston. She tucked the letter into the pocket of her apron and told no one, and went inside to start supper like her whole life hadn't just tilted sideways again. She should have told Ezra. She knew that even as she was folding the letter smaller and smaller until it fit into the bottom of her trunk, underneath a stack of handkerchiefs, out of sight. Because what would she even say? Mr. Holloway, there is a man in Boston who wishes to marry me to settle a debt my father left behind, and I am not certain what I intend to do about it. Because saying it out loud made it real in a way that scared her more than the letter itself. Because, and this was the part she really didn't want to examine too closely, because some small, cowardly corner of her heart was afraid of what she'd see on his face if she told him. Afraid it would be nothing. Afraid he'd simply nod the way an employer nods at news that doesn't concern him and say something like, well, you must do what's best, and she would understand once and for all exactly how much or how little she mattered to him. So she said nothing, which was, she would learn very soon, precisely the wrong choice. The cattle went missing on a Thursday. Amos rode up hard in the gray hour before full light, his horse lathered, his voice tight in a way Rosalind had never heard from him before. East pasture, he said, before he'd even swung down. 30 head gone, maybe more. Fence cut clean, not broke. Somebody knew what they were doing. Ezra was already moving toward the barn. Tracks, heading toward Blackwater Canyon. Fresh, couple hours old at most. Get the men. Rosalind stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself against a cold that had nothing to do with the morning air. Cattle rustling? Ezra said, catching her eye as he buckled his gun belt. Not just theft out here. It's a threat to everything this ranch is. How dangerous? Depends who's doing it. Which was not an answer designed to comfort her. Which she suspected he knew. He mounted his horse, paused, looked down at her with an expression that made her chest ache in a way she didn't have time to examine. Lock the doors, he said. If we're not back by dark, Bethany will come sit with you. Be careful. Something almost like a smile. Gone as fast as it came. Always am. And then he was riding hard toward the canyon, with 6 men at his back, rifles across their saddles, and Rosalind was left standing in a yard gone suddenly, achingly quiet. The waiting was its own kind of torment. Bethany arrived by mid-morning with a basket of mending, and a face carefully arranged, into calm that didn't quite reach her eyes. They'll be fine, Bethany said, which was the kind of thing people say when they aren't at all certain it's true. You've done this before. Waited, more times than I can count. Bethany's needle moved steady through fabric. Doesn't get easier, just gets more familiar. Which was, Rosalind thought, possibly the saddest true thing anyone had said to her in weeks. They rode back just after dusk. Dust-caked, exhausted, but upright, all of them, and the cattle strung out behind on lead ropes, tired but alive. Except something was wrong with the way Ezra sat his horse. Rosalind was off the porch before she decided to move, crossing the yard fast, and she saw it now, the careful, guarded way he held his left side, the way he swung down, from the saddle a half-second slower than a man with nothing wrong. You're hurt. It's nothing. Ezra. His name came out of her before she decided to use it. First time. It landed strange in the air between them, more intimate than she'd intended, and she watched something shift in his face at the sound of it. One of the men got a lucky punch in, he admitted. We caught 2 of them. Sheriff's got them locked up in town. Let me see. Rosalind. Let me see, or I'll assume it's worse than you're saying, and worry myself sick over it. Your choice. A ghost of a smile. Tired but real. Bossy, he said. Effective, she said back. In the kitchen, under lamplight, he lifted his shirt with obvious reluctance, and Rosalind's breath caught at the sight of it. A bruise spreading dark and ugly across his ribs, already swelling toward purple at the edges. You should have told me straight away. I've had worse. That's not the comfort you think it is. She fetched the arnica salve from her room, returned to find him still seated at the table, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the low light. Her hands were gentle as she worked the salve into the bruised skin, careful, slow, and underneath the careful clinical focus of tending a wound, something else moved through the room, the warmth of his skin under her fingers, the quiet catch in his breath. When she pressed too near a tender spot, the charged, humming silence that neither of them seemed willing to break. About yesterday, he began, voice lower than she'd heard it. What I was trying to say on the ride back. The front door burst open. Jesse Calloway, breathless, hat askew. Mr. Holloway, there's trouble at the saloon. Sheriff sent me. Says it's friends of the men you caught, and there's talk of them coming out here next. Ezra was on his feet before the sentence finished, wincing once at the movement, reaching for his gun belt. Tell the sheriff I'm coming. He glanced back at Rosalind, something frustrated and unfinished in his eyes. This conversation, he said, seems determined to keep getting interrupted. Go, she said. Be careful with those ribs. He paused at the door. When I get back, he said, we'll talk, all the way through this time. And then he was gone into the dark, and Rosalind stood alone in the kitchen, with the arnica jar still open on the table, wondering what exactly he'd meant to say, and what exactly she was going to say back about a letter still folded small at the bottom of her trunk. He came back near midnight, grim, exhausted. The confrontation in town had ended without gunfire, but the threat hadn't lifted. Friends of the captured rustlers had made it clear, apparently, that this wasn't finished. Doubling the night watch, he said, dropping into a chair at the kitchen table like his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up. Won't take chances. How long? Till the trial. A week, maybe less. Rosalind poured him coffee, sat across from him. I'm sorry this is happening while you're here, he said. Don't apologize. This is your life, protecting what's yours. Something in his face softened. There was a time, he said slowly, when all I cared about was more. More land, more cattle, success measured out in acres and head counts. He looked at her directly, and the directness of it made her pulse stumble. Lately I've been thinking there's more to want than that. Such as. He leaned forward. The lamplight caught the blue of his eyes and held it. Such as sharing all this with someone who understands why it matters. Someone who sees this land the way I. A gunshot cracked somewhere in the distance. Ezra was on his feet instantly, all the softness gone, from his face in an eye blink, replaced by something hard and alert. Stay inside. Lock the doors. And then he was gone into the night again, rifle in hand, and Rosalind was left standing in the kitchen doorway, with her heart slamming against her ribs, the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. She didn't stay inside, couldn't, because sitting still while men she cared about faced danger in the dark was not a thing her body seemed capable of, whatever her mind decided about it. She found the shotgun in the pantry, where she'd noticed it weeks before. Checked it was loaded the way her father had taught her years ago, insisting every educated woman ought to know how to defend herself even if she never needed to. She'd never needed to, until now maybe. She positioned herself at the kitchen window, looking out over the yard, and watched lanterns bobbing in the darkness near the corral. Heard voices. Heard, a moment later, more shots. Her hands were steady on the shotgun. Her heart was not steady at all. The confrontation lasted the better part of an hour, though it felt considerably longer standing at that window in the dark, counting shots, flinching at everyone. By the time it ended, the intruders driven off, one wounded man left behind for the sheriff to collect in the morning. Ezra found her still at her post, shotgun in hand, when he came through the door. He stopped, stared at her. "Where did you learn to handle one of those?" "My father believed in practical education." She lowered the gun slowly. "I'm not a particularly good shot, but I know which end is which." Something moved across his face. Wonder, maybe, or something closer to it. "You continue to surprise me, Rosalind Ashworth." "Is that a good thing?" He crossed the room, stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, could see the exhaustion, and the adrenaline still fighting for control of his features. "It's a very good thing," he said, voice dropped low. "I find myself thinking about you at the worst possible moments, checking fences, negotiating cattle prices, wondering what you're doing, what you're thinking." Her breath caught somewhere in her throat. "I've been having similar difficulties," she admitted. His hand came up, touched her cheek, calluses rough against her skin, and somehow that roughness felt like the gentlest thing anyone had done for her in years. "I don't want you to just stay on as my housekeeper," he said. Her heart stumbled. "What I mean is—" The back door banged open. Amos, breathless, blood on his sleeve, that wasn't his own. "Boss, need you at the bunkhouse." One of the men's hit. Ezra's hand dropped from her cheek like it had been burned. "Coming." And just like that, the moment folded shut again, and Rosalind stood alone in the kitchen for the second time. That night, wondering how many more times this particular conversation could be interrupted, before one of them simply gave up trying to finish it. 2 days later, Alonzo Pruitt came to find her. Not at the ranch. In town, where she'd gone with Bethany for supplies, moving quick and quiet between the wagon and the store like a man trying not to be seen doing what he was doing. "Miss Ashworth, a word, please." She hesitated, but something in his face, gray, sleepless, frightened in a way that had nothing to do with social embarrassment, made her follow him around the side of the building, out of Bethany's earshot. "I need you to tell Holloway something," Alonzo said, voice barely above a whisper. "Tell him to watch his back with Drummond's men. Tell him the note on his ranch isn't sitting quiet in some Denver bank anymore." Her whole body went still. "How do you know about that?" "Because I owe the same man," Alonzo said, and something in his face cracked open, just slightly, revealing the shame he'd clearly been carrying, since the day he'd turned her away in his own store. "That's why I sent you off, Miss Ashworth. Not my sister. Never was my sister. Drummond's man came to me 2 weeks before your train arrived. Told me my debts could wait if certain things were arranged in return. Told me a wife with no family, no connections, no one asking questions." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I'm not proud of what I did." Rosalind stared at him, something between fury and pity moving through her chest in equal uncomfortable measure. "You let me believe I'd been rejected for a sister who doesn't exist. I know. You humiliated me in front of a room full of strangers. I know, Miss Ashworth. I know exactly what I did." His voice cracked. "But I'm trying to fix it now the only way I know how. Tell Holloway. Tell him Drummond's not finished. Tell him." A shadow fell across them both. Alonzo's face went white. Rosalind turned. A man she didn't recognize stood a few feet off, arms crossed, watching them with an expression of flat, patient menace that made the hair on her arms rise. "Pruitt," the man said, pleasant, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "Mr. Drummond was hoping you'd remember our conversation about minding your own business." Alonzo's hands had begun to shake. "I was only saying good day to Miss Ashworth." "Course you were." The man tipped his hat to Rosalind. "Polite, terrible, ma'am," and walked away, unhurried, like a man with all the time in the world. Alonso let out a breath that shook on its way out. "Go," he said. "Tell Holloway. Tell him now before it's too late for either of us." Rosalind rode back to the ranch that afternoon with her mind racing, so fast she barely remembered the road, because now she had two secrets pressing against her ribs. The letter from Boston, folded small at the bottom of her trunk. And now this Drummond, watching, patient, dangerous, already reaching toward Ezra, with the same careful, cornering hand he'd used on Alonso. She found Ezra in the barn, checking over the horses that had been recovered. "I need to tell you something," she said. "It's important." He turned. Something in her voice must have carried, because his whole posture changed, alert and focused. "What is it?" She opened her mouth to tell him about Drummond, about Alonso's warning, about the man in town with the pleasant, terrible smile. Except at that exact moment, Amos appeared in the barn doorway, holding an envelope. "This came for you, Miss Ashworth. Fell out of your trunk when I was moving it for the cleaning. Didn't mean to pry, but the return address caught my eye." Lawyer looked like. He held it out. Ezra's eyes went to the envelope, to the return address, Abernathy and Sons, Boston, Massachusetts, visible even from where he stood. Something shuttered closed behind his eyes. "You've had a letter from a lawyer," he said slowly. "And you didn't mention it. Ezra, it's not what you... Is there someone waiting for you back east, Rosalind?" The question landed like a slap. Sharp, sudden, and underneath the sharpness, something raw, hurt, plain and unguarded. The kind of hurt a man only shows when he's already imagined losing something before he's lost it. "There's a man," she started. "A creditor's son. He wants to settle my father's debt through marriage. I never intended. You were going to leave. I was going to tell you tonight. Were you?" His voice had gone flat, careful. The voice of a man building a wall in real time, brick by brick, right in front of her. 6 weeks left on this arrangement of ours, Rosalind. 6 weeks, and you still saw fit to keep something like this folded up in the bottom of a trunk. That's not fair, isn't it? Something bitter moved across his face. You've known me a month, Rosalind. I've known plenty of women who smiled sweet right up until the better offer arrived. The words hit harder than he probably meant them to. She saw it land in his own face too, saw him almost take it back, and then watched him choose instead to let it stand. I am not one of those women, she said, voice shaking now, with something closer to anger than hurt. And I came here today to tell you something far more urgent than any letter from Boston. Alonzo Pruitt just warned me that Cornelius Drummond is holding a note over this ranch and that he's already threatened one man into silence over it. But clearly you'd rather stand here counting down the weeks on my contract like a debt of your own. Ezra went very still. Drummond, he said, holds a note on my ranch. Yes. How do you know that name? Her stomach dropped, because now she had to admit the second thing. The papers in the study. The name she'd found weeks ago, and never told him she'd seen. I found the papers, she said quietly. By accident. Weeks ago. I should have told you then. I didn't know how. The silence that followed felt like it had weight, like it might actually crush something if it went on long enough. So you've been keeping secrets from me, Ezra said finally, since nearly the day you arrived. And you've been keeping the exact same secret from everyone in this house, including yourself, apparently, since your father died. That landed too. She saw it land. That's different. Is it? Neither of them had an answer to that. They stood there in the barn, the horses shifting restless in their stalls, the late afternoon light slanting gold, and merciless through the open door, and the careful, fragile thing that had been building between them for weeks felt, in that moment, like it might simply come apart at the seams. I need to think, Ezra said finally, quiet, tired, about all of it. Ezra. Not tonight, Rosalind. He walked out of the barn without looking back, and Rosalind stood alone among the horses, the letter still clutched in her hand, feeling like the ground had shifted under her feet for the second time in as many weeks. Supper that evening was silent. Not the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to fill a room. The other kind, the kind that sits heavy on the chest and makes every clink of a fork against a plate sound too loud. Ezra left the table early, said something about checking the north fence line before dark. Rosalind didn't believe him for a second, and suspected he knew she didn't, and neither of them said so. She washed the dishes alone, stared out the window at the darkening yard, because this was exactly what she'd feared, wasn't it? That telling him the truth would cost her something. That the moment he learned there was a version of her life he didn't control, didn't know, hadn't been consulted on, the moment he learned she had a past that existed independent of him, he would look at her differently. Except some smaller, more honest part of her understood that wasn't quite fair either. He hadn't reacted like a man protecting his pride. He'd reacted like a man who'd been hurt before, badly, in ways she didn't fully understand yet, and who'd built his whole life around never being surprised by someone he trusted again, which didn't make the wall between them tonight any less real, which didn't make her chest ache any less, either. She was still awake past midnight, sitting at the kitchen table, with a single candle burning low, when she heard hooves in the yard. Fast. Urgent. She was at the window before the rider had fully stopped. Jessie Calloway, face white as flour in the moonlight. Miss Ashworth, is Mr. Holloway here? He's out checking the fence line. What's happened? Mr. Pruitt. Jessie's voice cracked. He came to warn folks. Rode straight to the sheriff's office not an hour ago, saying he had proof Drummond's been buying up debts all over the county to steal land out from under folks. Except before the sheriff could even get his boots on, 3 of Drummond's men caught him outside and beat him near senseless. Left him in the street. Said it was a lesson for anyone else thinking of talking. Rosalind's stomach turned to ice. Is he alive? Barely. Doc's with him now. Because she'd been the one who told him to speak. Because Alonzo Pruitt, cowardly, weak, complicit as he'd been, had finally, at real cost to himself, tried to do the right thing, and this was what it had bought him. Where's Mr. Holloway? Jessie asked again, more urgent now. Before Rosalind could answer, a new light bloomed on the horizon. Orange. Flickering. Growing. Fire. The barn, Jessie breathed. Oh God. The barn's burning. What happened next unspooled fast. Faster than thought. Faster than fear could properly organize itself into anything but action. Rosalind ran for the pantry. For the shotgun, her hands finding it faster this time. No fumbling, no hesitation. The particular grim efficiency of a woman who'd already learned this exact motion once, before, and hoped never to need it twice. Because whatever this was, deserters or Drummond's men or something worse, the barn didn't catch fire in the middle of the night entirely by accident, not 2 hours after Alonzo Pruitt had been beaten in the street for telling the truth. By the time she reached the yard, men were already shouting, already running with buckets toward the flames, and she saw shapes moving at the edge of the firelight that didn't belong to any of Ezra's hands. Shapes moving with purpose, with intent. A shot rang out, then another. Ezra came pounding across the yard on horseback, rifle already in hand, face lit orange, and grim by the burning barn behind him. Rosalind, get inside. I'm not leaving you out here alone. This isn't a discussion. Another shot, closer this time, close enough that Rosalind felt the air move near her shoulder, and every argument in her throat evaporated at once. She ran for the house, took up position at the kitchen window, exactly as she had the night the rustlers first came, shotgun steady in her hands despite the way her whole body was shaking. Because whatever had happened between her and Ezra that afternoon, whatever wall he'd built, whatever hurt still sat unresolved between them, none of it mattered right now. Right now there was only the fire and the shouting and the terrible orange light spreading across the yard, and the question of whether the man she loved, whether she'd admitted that to herself yet or not, was going to walk back through that door in one piece. The fight lasted only minutes, though every one of them stretched out endless and razor sharp. She watched Amos wrestle a man to the ground, watched Otis, one arm still stiff in its healing splint, swing a shovel with the other. Watched Ezra, rifle raised, drive off two riders who'd been trying to reach the house itself. And then, as fast as it had started, it was over. The attackers scattered, into the dark, hoofbeats fading fast toward the tree line. The barn still burned, but the men had gotten enough water on it to keep the fire, from the house, from the other outbuildings, from spreading into something that could have swallowed everything Ezra's father had built. Rosalind was out the door, before the smoke had even begun to clear, running across the yard toward Ezra, who stood staring at the burning barn, with an expression of grim, exhausted fury. "You're not hurt." "No." He turned to her. Something in his face had changed, since that afternoon, the wall from earlier cracked clean, through by the events of the last 20 minutes. "You?" "No." They stood there a moment, the barn crackling behind them, ash drifting down, through the firelight like something almost beautiful, if it hadn't meant what it meant. "Pruitt tried to warn the sheriff," Rosalind said. "Drummond's men beat him for it. He might not survive the night." Something dark and furious moved across Ezra's face. "This is the same man holding my note." "Yes. And he's decided burning me out is easier than waiting for me to default naturally." "It would seem so." Ezra looked at the barn, at the ruin of something his father had built, with his own two hands, still smoking against the night sky. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not by a long way." "No," Rosalind agreed. "It isn't." And standing there in the ash and the firelight, the letter from Boston still sitting unresolved somewhere between them, the argument from that afternoon still unfinished, Rosalind understood with sudden, terrible clarity that whatever came next, whatever Cornelius Drummond intended, whatever price he meant to extract, from this town, from Ezra, from her, it was going to require every bit of courage either of them had left. Ezra reached for her hand in the dark. She let him take it. Neither of them said anything else that night. There wasn't anything left to say, that the burning barn, and the beaten man in town, and the letter waiting silent in her trunk, hadn't already said far more clearly than words ever could. Something had to give, and soon. The morning after the fire, Willow Bend woke to smoke still hanging low over the valley. Rosalind hadn't slept. Couldn't have, even if her body had allowed it, not with the barn reduced to blackened timber in the yard, and Alonzo Pruitt lying somewhere in town, maybe alive, maybe not, because of a warning he tried to give on her account. She was in the kitchen, before dawn, coffee boiling, hands moving on instinct alone, when Ezra came in, from checking the damage. Soot on his shirt, exhaustion carved deep under his eyes. "Barn's a loss," he said. "Saved the tack room, saved the horses. Could have been worse. Could have been." He poured himself coffee. Didn't sit. "I need to ride into town," he said. "Check on Pruitt. Talk to the sheriff." "I'm coming with you." "Rosalind." "He warned us because of me, Ezra. I'm not staying behind while you go find out whether that cost him his life." Something in his face shifted. Not quite agreement. Something closer to recognizing he wasn't going to win this one. "Fine," he said. "But you stay close." "Always do," which wasn't strictly true, but it seemed the right thing to say given the morning. Doc Whitmore's front room had been turned into a sick room, curtains drawn against the light, the smell of carbolic, and old blood thick in the air. Alonzo Pruitt lay very still on a narrow cot, one eye swollen shut, ribs bound tight beneath a blood-spotted bandage. His breathing came shallow, careful, like even that cost him something. His sister sat beside the bed, and for the first time, since Rosalind had arrived in Willow Bend, the woman's face held nothing but plain, undisguised fear. "He's not woken since they brought him in," she said, not looking up. "Doc says his ribs may have torn something inside. Says we won't know for certain till—" She stopped. Couldn't finish it. Rosalind knelt by the bed, checked his pulse the way her grandmother had taught her. Thin, fast, not good but not gone either. He needs willow bark for the fever starting under his skin. she said. And someone watching him through the night in case that breathing changes. I can't lose him, his sister said. Quiet, Ra. He's all the family I have left. Which struck Rosalind hard because she hadn't once, in all her judgment of Alonzo Pruitt, stopped to consider that whatever cowardice had driven him, whatever fear had made him complicit in Drummond's schemes, some of it had come from exactly that. A frightened man trying, badly, to protect the only family he had. He tried to do right at the end, Rosalind said. That has to count for something. Does it? The woman said. Not really a question. Just tired. Outside, Ezra was talking with the sheriff, a broad, graying man named Coswell, who looked like he'd rather be doing almost anything else with his morning. 3 men, Coswell was saying. Description matches men who work for Drummond. But matching a description isn't proof, Holloway. And Drummond's got half the county's paper in his desk drawer. Man like that doesn't get arrested on a hunch. He burned my barn. You see him do it? No. Then it's your word, and a beaten shopkeeper's word against a man who owns more of this territory than the governor does. Coswell rubbed his face weary. I want him same as you do, Holloway. But I need something that'll hold up. Something more than smoke and bruises. Rosalind stepped forward before she'd fully decided to. What if you had the ledger? Both men turned. What ledger? Ezra said. The one Drummond's man used to track, which notes he'd bought, which debts he'd called in, which men he'd threatened into silence. She met Ezra's eyes. Alonzo mentioned it the day he warned me. Said Drummond's man kept records. Careful ones. Men like that always do. They need to know exactly what they're owed. Coswell straightened. You know where such a thing might be found? No, Rosalind admitted. But I know someone who might once he wakes. Which put everything once again on whether Alonzo Pruitt survived the night. He woke near midnight. Rosalind had stayed against his sister's protests, against her own exhaustion, sitting in a hard chair by his bed, with a bowl of willow bark tea gone cold on the table beside her. His one good eye opened slowly, found her face in the lamplight. Miss Ashworth, he rasped. Still here. Someone had to make sure you didn't die out of pure spite. A ghost of a smile crossed his ruined face, cost him clearly in pain. Wouldn't blame you if you'd let me. I considered it, she said. Decided against it. You warned us. That has to count. His eye closed briefly. When it opened again, something in it had steadied. Drummond's man, he whispered, keeps a ledger. Every note he's bought. Every threat he's made. Locked in the back office of the land agent's building. Man named Silas Reed handles it for him. A ragged breath. Reed's greedy and careless in equal measure. Leaves that office unlocked most nights, thinking no one in this town has the nerve to cross him. Where exactly? He told her. She found Ezra waiting outside, pacing the boardwalk in the dark. He's stable, she said. And he gave us something. She told him what Alonzo had said. Watched something sharpen behind Ezra's eyes. The exhaustion of the last 2 days burning away into something closer to purpose. That's breaking and entering, he said. That's evidence, she said back. Which is it going to be, Ezra? Because Coswell needs proof, and proof isn't going to walk itself into that office. He studied her a long moment. You're not doing this alone. I wasn't planning to. They went at 3 in the morning, when the street was empty, and the moon gave just enough light to move by without a lantern. The land agent's office sat dark and quiet, exactly as Alonzo had promised. The back doors lock old, and stubborn but not impossible. Not for a man who'd spent a lifetime fixing things with his hands. Inside, the office smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. Ezra found the desk. Rosalind found the drawer, locked tighter than the door had been, and it was her hairpin, in the end, that worked the small mechanism loose. The ledger sat inside, leather-bound, heavy with pages. Ezra opened it by the thin moonlight coming through the window, and Rosalind watched his jaw go tight as he read. It's all here, he said quietly. Every note, Every man he's threatened. Pruitt's dead. Mine. 6 others I didn't even know he'd touched. Pause, his voice dropping lower. There's a name for the men who burned my barn too, written right here like a payroll. Then we have him. We have him, Ezra agreed. If we can get this to Coswell, before Drummond realizes it's gone. Which was, of course, exactly when they heard the front door. They froze. Boots on the floorboards, slow, deliberate. A lantern's glow spilling under the connecting door. Ezra's hand went to his gun. Rosalind's hand closed tight around the ledger. The connecting door opened. Silas Reed stood there, lantern raised, and behind him, filling the doorway with the same patient, terrible calm Rosalind remembered. From the street outside the general store, stood Cornelius Drummond himself. Older than she'd pictured. Silver at the temples. Dressed like a man who'd never once in his life had to raise his voice to get exactly what he wanted. "Mr. Holloway," Drummond said, pleasant as a man greeting a neighbor over a fence. "And Miss Ashworth, how industrious of you both at this particular hour." "Drummond." Ezra's voice had gone hard as flint. "I see you've found my ledger." Drummond's eyes flicked to the book in Rosalind's hands, and something colder moved behind his calm expression. "That's rather inconvenient. You burned my barn." "I financed a business decision," Drummond said mildly. "What men do with financing is their own concern. You beat Alonzo Pruitt half to death. Mr. Pruitt made choices that had consequences. As will you, Mr. Holloway, if that book doesn't stay exactly where it belongs." Reed shifted the lantern. Behind him, in the shadow of the doorway, 2 more men had appeared, the same pleasant, terrible menace as the man, from the street, and Rosalind felt her heartbeat climb into her throat. "There are 2 of us," Ezra said, "and 4 of you. Bad odds for a man who prefers his violence quiet." "There don't need to be odds at all," Drummond said. "Hand over the ledger, walk out that door, and we'll simply agree this evening never happened. And if we don't," Drummond's smile didn't reach his eyes, "then we'll have a different sort of conversation, one considerably less civil." The silence that followed stretched taut as wire, and it was Rosalind, in the end, who broke it, not with fear, though fear sat heavy in her chest, but with something colder and steadier underneath it. "Sheriff Coswell knows we came here tonight," she said. "Knows exactly why. If we don't walk back into his office by first light, with this ledger in hand, he'll come looking. And he'll bring the whole town with him, because half of Willow Bend is written in these pages, as a debt you've been quietly strangling for over a year." Which was not strictly true. Coswell knew nothing of the sort, but Drummond didn't know that either, and Rosalind watched, with a small, fierce flicker of satisfaction, the first genuine crack appear in his composure. "You're bluffing," Drummond said. "Try me," Rosalind said, "or take the safer wager, and let a man of your reputation avoid finding out the hard way." The seconds stretched. Drummond's eyes moved to Ezra, to the gun at his hip, to the ledger clutched tight in Rosalind's hands. Then, slowly, he stepped back from the doorway. "This town," he said, voice gone soft and dangerous, "will remember who built half of it. Long after your little ranch and your little marriage are dust, Holloway." "Maybe," Ezra said, "but it won't remember you kindly." Drummond's jaw tightened. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the dark street, his men falling in behind him, and Rosalind let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That," she said, "was considerably more terrifying than I let on." "Could have fooled me," Ezra said. "You just talked down the richest man in the territory like you were haggling over eggs at market." "Practice," she said. "Boston drawing rooms were excellent training for men who think their money makes them untouchable." Something that was almost a laugh escaped him. Exhausted, relieved, real. They made it to Coswell's office before dawn, ledger in hand, and watched the sheriff's face change page by page, as he read what Drummond had spent a year building in careful, patient silence. "This'll do it," Coswell said finally. "This'll do it plenty. Drummond was arrested 3 days later. Not quietly, not the way he'd have preferred, given his reputation and his money, and his lifetime of assuming both would always be enough to protect him. The whole town turned out to watch, lining the street the way people do for a hanging or a parade, and there was something almost biblical about the sight of Cornelius Drummond, hands bound, being walked to the same jail that had briefly held the rustlers he'd once hired. Alonzo Pruitt watched, from a chair on the boardwalk, still too weak to stand unassisted, his sister hovering close beside him. When Drummond passed, their eyes met for one brief second. Drummond said nothing. Alonzo, surprisingly, did. "Should have left well enough alone," he called out, voice still raw and thin from his injuries. "Man tries to steal a whole town's future one signature at a time. Sooner or later somebody's going to read the fine print." A few people laughed. Grim laughter, but laughter all the same, the kind that comes after a long fear finally lifts. Rosalind stood beside Ezra near the front of the crowd, and felt his hand find hers, without either of them deciding it consciously. "It's over," she said. "Most of it," Ezra said. "Not all." She knew what he meant. The letter from Boston still sat, unanswered, in her trunk. They talked that night on the porch, finally, without gunfire or fire, or debt collectors interrupting them. "Tell me about the letter," Ezra said. "All of it, from the start." So she did. Josiah Kane, her father's failed venture, the debt that had outlived him, patient as Drummond's own schemes, waiting for someone to collect. The suggestion, wrapped in careful lawyer's language, that marriage might settle everything cleanly. "And what do you want to do?" Ezra asked when she'd finished. "I don't want to marry a man I met once at my father's funeral to settle a debt. That was never mine to begin with," she said. "But I don't know yet whether I have a choice in the matter." "You always have a choice," Ezra said, quiet, certain. "It might not be an easy one, but it's yours. And if I choose to stay here?" He turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, his eyes had gone soft in a way she'd rarely seen. "Then I'd count myself the luckiest man in this territory," he said. "But Rosalind, I need you to understand something first. I wasn't fair to you the day I found that letter. I let old wounds speak louder than good sense. I've watched men I trusted disappear when things got hard back during the war, and some part of me's been braced for that ever since. Waiting for it. Nearly caused it myself with you out of nothing but fear." "I should have told you sooner," she said. "About the letter. About Drummond's papers. I let fear make my choices too. Then maybe," he said, "we're better suited to each other than either of us realized." Something in her chest, tight and guarded. Since the day she'd stepped off, that train finally eased. "I have a letter to answer," she said. "Properly this time. No more hiding it at the bottom of a trunk." She wrote to Josiah Kane the following morning. Told him plainly that she would not be settling her father's debts through marriage to a stranger, that she intended instead to work with the lawyer's office to establish a fair repayment arrangement, over time, funded by her own labor and her own choices, and that if he found this answer unsatisfactory, he was welcome to pursue the matter through whatever legal means he believed available to him. It felt, sealing the envelope, like closing a door on the last piece of her old life still hanging open. Whatever came of it, and word would come back months later, that Kane had accepted the arrangement without further protest, apparently unwilling to spend more money pursuing a debt than the debt itself was worth. She had made the choice herself. Not been handed it. Not been rescued from it. Chosen it. Ezra found her in the garden 2 weeks later, kneeling among vegetables that had thrived under her care since the day she'd first arrived. "There's something I want to show you," he said. "Up on the ridge. Will you ride with me?" They rode together in the golden light of late afternoon, up past the north pasture, past the creek, with its thick cottonwoods, to a rise overlooking the whole valley. He helped her down, pointed toward a cluster of trees near the creek bend. She saw it slowly, a structure, small but solid, timber still pale, and new against the older growth around it. "Is that a house?" "For rooms," Ezra said. "Built to grow as needed. Men have been working on it a month now. He turned to face her fully, and for a moment he didn't speak at all, just stood there, hat in his hands, looking at her the way a man looks at something he's been afraid to want out loud. I didn't want to bring you into the house my parents built, he said finally. Didn't want you living inside someone else's memory, sleeping in rooms that still smelled like my mother's rosewater and my father's pipe smoke. I wanted us to build something ourselves, from the ground up, something that belongs to no one's past, but our own future. Tears rose, unexpected and warm. You built us a home. I want us to build a life, he said. Together. A slow one. A whole one. If you'll have me, Rosalind Ashworth. Yes, she said, before he'd even finished the question properly. Yes, Ezra Holloway. I will. He laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she'd rarely heard, from him, and pulled her into his arms, lifting her briefly off her feet, before setting her down for a kiss that felt, finally, like an answer to every interrupted conversation that had come before it. The wedding took place on a bright Saturday in early autumn, on the porch of the new house, with the whole town of Willow Bend gathered beneath the cottonwoods. Bethany had organized the whole affair, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd clearly been waiting for this occasion, since the week Rosalind arrived. Quilts and household goods arrived, from half the women in the county. The ranch hands, gruff and unaccustomed to sentiment, had spent their spare hours adding careful touches to the new house, built-in shelves for Rosalind's books, a garden plot already turned and ready for planting. Alonzo Pruitt attended, walking slowly, still favoring his healing ribs, his sister beside him looking, for the first time, since Rosalind had met her, something close to at peace. I owe you an apology, Alonzo said quietly, before the ceremony began. More than one, probably, for the day at the store, for everything that came after. You warned us when it mattered most, Rosalind said. That's the part I'll remember. He nodded. Something in his ruined face eased. Good luck to you, Miss Ashworth. Mrs. Holloway, she corrected gently. As of about 10 minutes from now. A real smile, finally, cracked through his exhaustion. Mrs. Holloway, then. The ceremony itself was brief. Vows spoken plainly, without embellishment, in front of a whole community that had watched this improbable story unfold one careful chapter at a time. The rejected bride, the ranch on the edge of ruin, the patient, careful courtship built out of interrupted conversations and shared danger. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ezra's kiss was restrained in deference to their audience, but Rosalind felt the full weight of everything unspoken behind it. The celebration ran late into the evening. Fiddle music, dancing, food enough to feed the whole territory, or so it seemed. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit among the cottonwoods, casting the whole gathering in warm gold light. Any regrets, Mrs. Holloway? Ezra asked, finding her near the creek during a quiet moment away from their guests. Not a single one, she said, though I still can't quite believe how it's all turned out. No regrets about the train that never took you east? She looked up at him, this man who had stood up for her on the worst day of her life and never once stopped. My life is here, she said, with you. That was decided the moment you asked if I was still interested in staying, and meant it. His kiss, this time, held nothing back. A year passed. Willow Bend recovered slowly from the shadow Cornelius Drummond had cast over it, the way towns do, not all at once, but steadily, one rebuilt barn and one settled debt at a time. Drummond himself sat in a territorial prison awaiting trial on charges that would, eventually, see most of his stolen land returned to the families he tried to strip it from. Alonzo Pruitt sold his store to a young couple with more warmth in them than he'd ever managed, and moved to Denver with his sister, writing occasionally, always with the same careful gratitude, always signing off the same way. Still trying to be the man I should have been from the start. Rosalind opened a small evening school in the spare room of the general store's new owners, teaching reading and figures to the women of Willow Bend who'd never had the chance, Bethany among them, who took to sums with a fierce, delighted determination that made Rosalind's throat tighten every time she watched her work through a column of numbers. The ranch prospered, new barn raised, where the old one had burned, sturdier than before, the whole community turning out to build it in a single long, exhausting, joyful day. And in the evenings, Rosalind and Ezra sat together on the porch of the house he'd built for them, just the two of them, and the wide Colorado sky, and the particular quiet of two people who no longer needed to fill every silence with words. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked one evening, watching the sun drop low behind the mountains. "The train, the store, all of it." "Every day," Ezra said. "Think about how close I came to walking past that store without stopping. Think about what I'd have lost if I had. You'd never have known to miss it." "I'd have missed it anyway," he said. "Some things a man knows to grieve even without knowing their name." She reached for his hand, found it already reaching for hers. "We found each other exactly when we needed to," she said. "Even if it took a rejected proposal and a burned barn and half a county's worth of trouble to get there." "Especially because of all that," she said. "I don't think I'd have known my own strength otherwise." Ezra turned to look at her, the last gold light of evening catching in his eyes. "You'd have found it," he said, "one way or another. You're not the kind of woman who waits to be rescued, Rosalind Holloway. You never were." "No," she agreed, settling against his shoulder, as the stars began to surface overhead. "But it helps having someone worth standing beside, while you find it." They sat together as the last light faded from the valley, the new barn dark against the horizon, the schoolhouse lamp still burning faint in the distance, where Bethany was finishing her lessons for the night, and the whole wide territory settling into the particular, hard-won piece of a place that had fought for its own future and won. Because that, in the end, was the whole of the story. Not a woman rescued, a woman who had crossed half a country alone, been discarded by a man too frightened to keep his word, and built, out of nothing, but grit and grief, and quiet, stubborn courage, an entire life worth having. And a man who had learned, finally, that the strongest thing he could offer wasn't protection. It was trust, freely given, freely returned, which, as it turned out, was worth more than every acre either of them owned.